Shalom, this is Tony Robinson of Restoration of Torah Ministries, and this is our Chiastic Revelation series on YouTube. And today what we're going to do is we're going to look at the chiastic structure of Genesis chapter 21 verses 13 through 21b. It's the story of the banishment of Ishmael, and in this story we're going to see the second function of the central axis. And here, what you can see here is the chiastic structure. I have it in full here. It progresses from Genesis 21 verse 13 all the way through verse 21b. And again, as I said, as we go down the chiastic structure, we're simply going chronologically through the scriptures here. You can see how the scripture verses are increasing chronologically as we finally make it down to the bottom. But what we're going to see is that the themes in the first half, right here from elements A through F, the themes in the first half will be repeated in the second half in reverse order. So let's go ahead and look at Genesis 20. Let's look at theme A, the first one. All right, it says the son of the slave woman, and this was an Egyptian woman, it was Hagar, I will make into a nation. That is thematically connected to Genesis 21:21b, where it says Ishmael's mother took an Egyptian wife for Ishmael. The thematic connections are these. The slave woman in the first half is thematically connected to Ishmael's mother. That's the first connection. Secondly, where it says I will make him into a nation, that's thematically connected to his mother taking an Egyptian wife for him, because the first step in making Ishmael into a nation is to have him get married so he can have children. Pretty practical, eh? All right, let's go on now to our second element of our chiastic structure, Genesis 21:14b and 21:21a. It says, she, Hagar, departed and strayed in the desert of Beer-sheva. That is thematically connected to the second half where it says he lived in the desert of Paran. Okay, the obvious connection here is that when Hagar, she strayed, it talks about where she strayed. She strayed in the desert of Beer-sheva. That is a desert. And in the second half here, it talks about how Ishmael lived in the desert. The thematic connection there is obviously the place of the desert. So let's look at our third thematic connection in this chiastic structure. It involves Genesis 21:15-16a to Genesis 21:19b through 20 in the second half of the chiastic structure. This one says, the water of skin was consumed, and she cast off the boy beneath one of the trees. She sat herself down at a distance, some bow shots away. Now we're going to look in the second half, and we're going to see the different thematic connections. Where it says the water of skin was consumed in the first half, in the second half, it says she filled the skin with water. And so one of the things that we see here is that quite often the thematic connections represent reversals or opposites. Okay, the skin being consumed versus the skin being filled with water. Where it says she cast off the boy beneath one of the trees, it says that God was with the youth. Okay, she is separating herself from the youth, but Adonai is drawing him close. He was with him. Okay, and where it says she sat herself down at a distance, it says some bow shots away. Well, it says in the second half that he dwelt in the desert and became an archer. And so now you understand why when it describes the distance between Hagar and Ishmael as some bow shots away, why did it use that expression? One of the reasons why is probably because it's obvious the story is written chiastically. It describes her as being bow shots away because in the second half it talks about Ishmael being an archer. This is an absolutely beautiful connection. All right, let's keep going, and we're going to go to our element D, and we're going to see how it is. She says, let me not see the death of the child. And then right here, it's in the second half, it says, God opened her eyes and she perceived a well of water. Now, in this case, she doesn't want to see the death of the child. Let me not see. Whereas right here, it says, God opened her eyes. Again, the obvious connection is with the eyes. And she doesn't want to see the death of the child, but she perceived the well. And again, this is an opposite. Death. On the one hand, there's death in the first half. On the second half, she sees a well of water. Now, the well of water is going to give him life. And so this is a reversal. But this is also an example of how a chiastic structure can teach you something. Here we're being taught that life is equal to a well of water. Because again, the connection is an opposite or a reversal. Death versus the well of water, which brings life. Now, this is taught in many other places, that a well of water equals life, and death equals a pit with no water in it. We see this in Genesis 37 with Joseph, who's thrown into a pit with no water, and we see this in the case of Jeremiah in Jeremiah 38, where Jeremiah was thrown into a pit with no water. But the important point here is that the chiastic structure is teaching you something through the reversal. And next, we're going to look at Genesis element E. And in element E, it talks about how she sat at a distance, lifted her voice, and wept. All right. Her sitting at a distance is thematically connected in the second half to her arising. Again, we see a reversal. Her lifting up her voice is thematically connected when Adonai said, lift up the youth. We're going to go to the next element, element F. We're going to see how those are thematically connected. It says that God heard the voice of the lad in the first half, and in the second half it says God heard the voice of the lad where he was. And again, it was just the same phrase. And then lastly, we have our central axis. And our central axis is how the angel of Adonai called to Hagar saying, what troubles you? Now here's the most important point here. Here we have a chiastic structure. This time the central axis is functioning as the point of turning. It's the point of turning. In other words, everything in our chiastic structure in the first half from element A through F was negative. Ishmael is banished. They wind up wandering in the desert. They run out of water. He's about to die. Everything is negative. But then we have the central axis where the angel calls out to Hagar and says, what troubles you? And from that moment on, elements A through F in the second half, everything is positive. They find the water. The youth is going to live. He lives in the desert. And so this is a beautiful example of how the second function of a central axis. So what have we learned? We've learned that the story of the banishment of Ishmael is told in a thematic pattern called a chiastic structure. The central axis functions sometimes as the turning point in the story. Now, last week we saw that the central axis can function as the most important point. It's the way Adonai wants to highlight something. In this example, we see that the central axis is the turning point. The same thing happens in 2 Samuel 15:10 through chapter 20, verse 2. That passage is a chiastic structure about David's flight from Absalom. Everything is happening negative to David until the central axis where three of his friends bring him provisions. And from that moment on, David formulates a plan and moves on to victory. We also learned that a well of water is equal to life, and that a pit with no water in it is equal to death. And we also learned that many thematic connections involve reversals or opposites of the theme. Lastly, we learned that Adonai uses chiastic structures to teach us thematic lessons, associations, and relationships. We saw that with the well of water equaling life versus a pit with no water in it equaling death. And so these chiastic structures, we're going to look to them because they're going to teach us theology. Well, I hope you understood that, and we'll continue at another time, but may Adonai bless you. Amen.